It is my ambition to say in 10 sentences what others say in a whole book. Friedrich Nietzsche may strike you as a pompous ass, and fair play if he does, but his writing is so maddeningly rich that one feels almost obliged to indulge him. Twilight of the Idols was written in August of 1888, during Nietzsche's summer in Turin. He later admitted he was almost ashamed of how quickly he had produced such a marvelous book. This period marked an extraordinary surge of creative vitality for Nietzsche, who produced a series of books in rapid succession. Yet only 3 months later, on January 9, 1889, in the same city of Turin, Nietzsche collapsed and descended into madness. His friend, Franz Overbeck, rushed to his side and brought him to a psychiatric clinic in Basel. Though Nietzsche lived for another 11 years, the brilliance and sharp spirit that filled his works would never return. In this book, Nietzsche takes on the bold challenge to transform the way we see life itself. Nietzsche ends the preface of the book with the sentence, Turin, 30th of September 1888, the day where the first book of the re-evaluation of all values was completed. Nietzsche had envisioned a book titled Umwertung aller Werte, the re-evaluation of all values, in which he planned to settle accounts once and for all with his contemporaries and with the long defenders of decadence throughout history. In the last years, before his collapse, Nietzsche was at his most vigorous and creative. He believed his works would transform humanity's understanding of existence itself, even envisioning a new chronological divide to replace the Christian era, a time before Nietzsche and a time after Nietzsche. And if one were to accuse him of trying to turn the world upside down, Nietzsche would reply that it was already inverted. He was simply setting it right. However, because of his collapse, the project of re-evaluation was never fully completed. If I haven't yet convinced you of the importance of Twilight of the Idols, perhaps Nietzsche himself can. In Ecce Homo, he reflects on Twilight of the Idols, writing, "This work, which covers scarcely 150 pages, with its cheerful and fateful tone, like a laughing demon, and the production of which occupied so few days that I hesitate to give their number, is altogether an exception among books. There is no work more rich in substance, more independent, more upsetting, more wicked." Let us begin with the title. Götzen-Dämmerung, Twilight of the Idols, is an unmistakable nod to Richard Wagner's Götzen-Dämmerung, Twilight of the Gods. Wagner was once Nietzsche's great idol and friend, but in time he became his fiercest enemy. To Nietzsche, Wagner exemplifies everything wrong with the German spirit in the 1800s. There is a famous myth that Nietzsche once stormed out of one of Wagner's new operas, Parsifal, in which his Christian symbolism was heavy. From that moment, their friendship was never the same. With the title, Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche signals the downfall of the old gods, figures he saw as nothing more than false idols. The so-called truths of the past must be dismantled, for the time has come to clear the way for a new truth. Nietzsche often employs the metaphors of dawn and twilight to signal the transient nature of truths and values. This imagery can be traced back to ancient philosophy, particularly Plato, who pointed to the sun as the source that makes things visible, noble, and ultimately true. Plato remained faithful to Parmenides, who taught that the unchanging being lies at the core of reality. Nietzsche, by contrast, sided with Heraclitus, for whom the essence of reality is not static being, but ever-changing becoming. But what for Nietzsche is an idol? In Ecce Homo, he writes that an idol is nothing other than what has until now been called truth with a capital T. German nationalism, democracy, Wagnerianism, anti-Semitism, feminism. These are all idols in his eyes. Yet towering above them all stood the greatest idol of his age, Christianity. It is no surprise then that he would dedicate an entire book to its demolition, pointedly titled The Antichrist. The book's subtitle is fittingly called How to Philosophize with a Hammer. People often imagine it as Nietzsche wielding a sledgehammer, smashing the old gods and crumbling truths. But in reality, the image he had in mind was that of a doctor's percussion hammer, an instrument used not to destroy, but to test and diagnose. Nietzsche saw himself in this role, a healer of his age, a self-proclaimed doctor of nihilism. Twilight of the Idols opens with epigrams and arrows, a collection of short, pointed phrases loaded with deeper meaning. Among them is perhaps Nietzsche's most famous line: "From life's military school, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Though contrary to the joke, he didn't borrow it from Kelly Clarkson. Another well-known aphorism from this section is, "Without music, life would be a mistake." The book progresses through concise collections of texts, each organized around a central theme. In this discussion, we will follow its linear structure, introducing each chapter alongside its theme, and then examining Nietzsche's perspective in greater depth. The problem of Socrates. The opening chapter, The Problem of Socrates, centers on the figure often regarded as the first true philosopher. In many of Plato's dialogues, Socrates serves as his mouthpiece, shaping and delivering the ideas that would become foundational to Western thought. Through the combined influence of Socrates and Plato, a new moral framework emerged, one that, arguably, has dominated Western civilization for nearly 2,000 years. The central theme of this chapter is that of the denial and decay of our instincts. In this chapter, Nietzsche concludes with the figure of Socrates, whom he holds responsible for the decline he describes. As he puts it, "The wisest sages of all times have reached the same judgment about life. It's worthless. Always and everywhere we have heard the same sound coming from their mouths, a sound full of doubt, full of melancholy, full of fatigue with life, full of hostility to life. Even Socrates said as he died, 'Living, that means being sick a long time. I owe a rooster to the savior Asclepius.' Asclepius, the ancient Greek god of healing and medicine, plays a symbolic role in Socrates' final words. When asked what saves a sick person, the answer is death. Thus, as he lay dying, Socrates claimed he owed a rooster to Asclepius. Nietzsche interprets this confession as Socrates' acknowledgement that he regarded life itself as a kind of illness and death as its only cure. Nietzsche traces the lineage of the wisest sages and priests back to Socrates. Such figures consistently condemn life as worthless, portraying it as pointless suffering. This life must be overcome or abolished for the sake of a higher good. In Christianity, that higher good is the promise of heaven. For Socrates, it is the world of ideas, where truth and order reign supreme. In both cases, however, the underlying conviction is the same. Life is an illness, suffering is its essence, and suffering is something bad. To fully grasp Nietzsche's point, it is essential to recall what he so admired in the old Greeks before Socrates and Plato. These earlier Greeks, he argues, confronted the harsh reality of suffering without life denial. They embraced the ethos of warriors, seeking to strengthen themselves through struggle. Their instincts and drives were not suppressed but transformed into greatness. Yet, as with all great civilizations, decline eventually set in. With this decay, the noble acceptance of suffering and the creative transformation of human drives was lost. For Nietzsche, both Socrates and Plato embody the forces of decay. He argues that when a great civilization begins to decline, it creates space for figures who present themselves as wise healers. These self-proclaimed sages claim to cure suffering by defining what is good and what is bad. Yet, in doing so, they condemn our natural instincts and drives as evil. Nietzsche's counter-remedy is straightforward. One absolutely must reach out and try to grasp this astounding finesse, that the value of life cannot be assessed. For Nietzsche, life has no inherent or objective value. Our values are ultimately without foundation. Those who insist otherwise are the so-called wisest sages, whom Nietzsche so deeply despises. In this chapter, he even suggests that Socrates' ugliness his distorted instincts, and his obsessive reliance on rationality are symptoms of the very decay he represents. To Nietzsche, Socrates' final words are not the testament of a wise man, but a confession. Socrates was sick. Socrates, he is no doctor, he said to himself softly. That is the only doctor here. Socrates himself has just been sick for a long time. The opening chapter finds Nietzsche offering a new perspective on instincts through his critique of Socrates, who had characterized these natural drives as primitive and evil. And thus Nietzsche philosophizes with the doctor's hammer, trying to heal us from this ancient sickness that would have us deny our own instincts. Reason within philosophy. In the second chapter, Nietzsche turns to the role of reason within philosophy. Throughout the philosophical tradition, reason has consistently been elevated above the senses, treated as the highest authority. At the very beginning of this section he writes, "Everything that philosophers have handled for thousands of years now has been conceptual mummies. Nothing real escaped their hands alive. They kill and stuff whatever they worship. These gentlemen who idolize concepts, they endanger the life of whatever they worship. For them, death, change, and age, like reproduction and growth, are objections, refutations even. Whatever is, does not become. Whatever becomes, is not." In this fragment, Nietzsche points to what he regards as the core mistake of the philosophical tradition, its fixation on what is permanent, on things that are, rather than on what is constantly in the process of becoming. As mentioned in the introduction, this reflects the classic distinction between Parmenides, who emphasized being, and Heraclitus, who emphasized becoming. What are the consequences of this choice? It leads to the rejection of our senses. Why do we fail to perceive permanence through our senses and instead encounter only change and becoming? Because, the philosopher would argue, our senses deceive us and feed us false information. Thus, our senses, our instincts, and even our bodies are cast aside in favor of a lingering for permanence. For Nietzsche, this is the ultimate form of life denial, an inheritance from Parmenides and his fixed notion of being. What follows is Nietzsche's tribute to the thinker he admires most, Heraclitus. I set aside, with great respect, the name of Heraclitus. While the rest of the mass of philosophers were rejecting the testimony of their senses because the senses displayed plurality and change, he rejected the testimony of the senses because they displayed things as if they had a duration and unity. Even Heraclitus did not do justice to the senses. They do not lie either in the way the Eleatics taught or in the way he taught. They do not lie at all. And thus, in this chapter, Nietzsche calls for a re-evaluation of the role of our senses, restoring them to their rightful place as the foundation of our experience, rather than dismissing them as deceptive. Nietzsche philosophizes with the doctor's hammer, trying to heal us from our over-reliance on reason and our denial of the senses. How the true world finally became a fable. This chapter continues the argument from the preceding one, exploring how sensory experience was diminished while rational thought was elevated. This hierarchy enabled the construction of an eternal, unchanging realm, a quote-unquote true world, designed to diminish the value of our sensible, changing world. The third chapter structurally takes a different approach. In a brief text, Nietzsche traces the evolution of his philosophical error through concise aphoristic statements. He titles it fittingly as the chronicle of a fundamental error, the invention of a so-called true world set in opposition to the world we actually perceive and inhabit through our senses. Nietzsche begins with Plato, who claimed that the true reality consisted of eternal ideas, a realm of permanence reached through reason and wisdom. The true world, attainable for the wise, the devout, the virtuous, they live in it, they are it. Oldest form of the idea, relatively clever, simple, convincing. Paraphrase of the assertion, I, Plato, am the truth. Christianity adapts this framework, positioning the true world as attainable through virtue and penance. With the arrival of modernity, however, certainty dissolves. The supposed true world becomes elusive, unknowable, shrouded in uncertainty, like mist obscuring the sun. Here, philosophy begins its turn towards secular thinking. Nietzsche then traces how over time the notions of a true world ultimately collapse under scrutiny. We have done away with the true world. What world is left over? The apparent one, maybe? But no! Along with the true world, we have also done away with the apparent. Midday, moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest error, high point of humanity. Incipit Zarathustra. In the last phrase, Nietzsche argues that in our acceptance that the true world should be cast aside, we have once and for all done away with the apparent world. Here Nietzsche ends the full paragraph with a reference to his famous book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. If you want to learn more about this enigmatic book, check out our video we made a year ago. Once more, Nietzsche wields his philosophical hammer, demolishing the supposed quote-unquote true world and restoring value to the immediate sensory reality we actually inhabit. Morality as anti-nature. In the 4th chapter, Nietzsche once again takes up a focused theme, this time morality and the passions. He critiques traditional moral systems for condemning our passions and desires outright, treating them as inherently bad. It used to be that on account of the stupidity in passion, one made war against passion itself, one conspired to destroy it. All the old moral monsters are of one mind on this point. Il faut tuer les passions. Nietzsche likens this moral approach to a dentist who extracts a patient's teeth simply because they cause pain, an act of destruction rather than healing. Yet Nietzsche is no advocate of unrestrained hedonism where passions and desires run wild. Instead, he insists they should be cultivated, shaped, and directed in a life-affirming way. What has been praised as quote-unquote virtuous in traditional moral systems, however, has been precisely the opposite. Unnatural. Rather than channeling our drives, morality has sought to abolish them altogether, to castrate the very instincts that give life its strength and vitality. Christianity never asks, how does one spiritualize, beautify, deify a desire? Its discipline has always emphasized eradication. Nietzsche goes on to cast love itself in a new light, not as something that denies desire, but as a way of spiritualizing it. For him, amor fati, the love of one's fate, means affirming one's deepest nature without resent or denial. Even enmity and conflict, far from being purely destructive, are valuable expressions of our instincts. They sharpen us, strengthen us, and serve life. To fully grasp what Nietzsche means when he condemns morality as anti-nature, however, we must first ask, what is nature for Nietzsche? For Nietzsche, nature is not a realm of permanence or stability, but one of conflict and becoming. At its core lies the will to power, a ceaseless struggle, a creative chaos that both strengthens and drives life forward. For a more detailed exploration of this concept, I would point you to our video on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where we delve into it at length. From this perspective, Nietzsche's critique of morality becomes sharper. Traditional moral frameworks, by seeking to castrate our passions and desires, run directly against what is natural. Nietzsche instead calls for their affirmation, for saying yes to the instincts and drives that constitute our very being. That affirmation, the recognition of our passions as life-giving rather than life-denying, is the decisive swing of the hammer in this chapter. The 4 Great Errors. In the 5th chapter, The 4 Great Errors, Nietzsche lists what great errors have been made in Western thought. The error of confusing cause and effect, the error of false causality, the error of imaginary causes, and the error of free will. The first 3 errors all concern the misuse of causality to justify moral claims. Nietzsche argues that people often believe virtue produces happiness, whereas he insists the reverse is true. Happiness is first assumed, and virtue follows from it. As he puts it, in a formula, their virtue is the effect of their happiness. Nietzsche further argues that our physical constitution, even our metabolism, often determines both positive and negative effects. Yet despite this, the body and its processes are frequently devalued or dismissed. The final error, however, is the most striking and revealing. Nietzsche maintains that the notion of free will is nothing more than a fabrication of theologians. By inventing it, they created a mechanism through which individuals can be held responsible, and therefore made dependent upon religious authority. Without the concept of free will, there would be no foundation for guilt and consequently no way to hold people morally accountable. Nietzsche's critique operates on the level of psychological consequences. How have concepts such as cause and effect or free will been employed to uphold and legitimize moral systems? Nietzsche concludes the chapter by stating that no one is responsible for who they are or for the conditions that shape them. The fatality of our essence cannot be separated from the fatality of all that was and all that will be. It is worth noting that the structure of the book appears to shift at this point. Nietzsche's hammer is still at work, though now in a different sense. The following chapters, which I will touch upon only briefly, seem less systematically organized. Much of their content either reiterates earlier points or assumes a detailed familiarity with specific thinkers, poets, and writers. In the 6th chapter, titled Those Who Improve Humanity, Nietzsche turns his attention to those who present themselves as improvers of humanity. Readers familiar with the gay science will recognize a similar critique to the one found at the beginning of that work. For a deeper exploration of the gay science, see the video we have dedicated to it. Nietzsche's criticism here parallels his critique of Socrates. Figures who claim to elevate humanity often wield their influence in a way that ultimately denies life. Against this tendency, Nietzsche calls for philosophers to move beyond morality itself, as he writes, "My demand on philosophers is well known, that they place themselves beyond good and evil, that they put the illusion of moral judgment beneath them. This demand falls from an insight which was formulated for the first time by me, that there are no moral facts at all." According to Nietzsche, the supposed moral facts that philosophers and reformers rely on have historically been used to tame the animalistic side of human beings, their desires, passions, and instincts. In chapter 7, titled What the Germans Are Missing, Nietzsche analyzes the German spirit and its decadence. Nietzsche believed that the German spirit confused greatness with weight, taking pride in its seriousness, depth, and metaphysics, while neglecting vitality, style, and artistry. He saw its obsession with nationalism and state power as a herd instinct disguised as cultural achievement, flattening individuality. For Nietzsche, this spirit represented a form of cultural decadence instead of producing life-affirming creativity. It produced obedience, pedantry, and a dull worship of authority. In the 8th chapter, titled Raids of an Untimely Man, Nietzsche surveys a range of historical figures, examining whether their lives and ideas contributed to or detracted from the flourishing of humanity. Thinkers and leaders such as Rousseau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Napoleon, and Goethe, among others, are discussed, each for better or worse. While it's certainly a fascinating chapter, it resists concise summary without engaging more deeply with the thought of these individual figures. For that reason, I encourage you to explore it yourself. Should there be a strong demand or dissatisfaction with my brevity here, I will gladly devote a full video to the chapter. For now, however, a closer treatment would take us too far. In the last chapter, titled What I Owe the Ancients, Nietzsche somewhat megalomanically addresses what he believes he owes to the ancients. He contrasts the life-affirming vitality of certain pre-Socratic thinkers, such as Heraclitus, along with select Roman poets, against what he sees as the decadence of Plato, Christianity, and even modern German culture. Nietzsche admires the Greeks for their capacity to confront existence directly, to embrace tragedy, and to affirm life without relying on metaphysical constellations or moralistic denials. Plato in particular becomes the target of sharp criticism. To Nietzsche, Plato embodies a spirit of decline and stands as a forerunner of Christian morality. Plato is boring. Ultimately, my mistrust in the case of Plato reaches into the depths. I find him so divergent from all the fundamental instincts of the Hellenes, so overmoralized, such a Christian before his time. If I weren't so lazy and I were to recreate this video, I would argue that Twilight of the Idol sheds a radically different light on certain key aspects of human life. Nietzsche forces us to reconsider our instincts, our senses, the sensible world, our passions and desires, and our very body. These form the backbone of the book's first 50 pages. Instead of dismissing instincts as primitive or dangerous, Nietzsche highlights their creative and life-affirming power. Instead of treating the senses as deceptive, he restores them to their rightful role as the foundation of experience. Instead of devaluing the sensible changing world in favor of some eternal quote-unquote true world, he celebrates becoming and impermanence as the very essence of life. And instead of condemning passions and desires, he urges us to spiritualize and affirm them rather than castrate them through moral system. Instead of demeaning the body, Nietzsche insists that it is our central, our health, our constitution, even our metabolism shape who we are more profoundly than abstract ideas ever could. Taken together, Nietzsche is swinging his philosophical hammer against centuries of moral and metaphysical traditions that have denied life at its root. The idols he demolishes are the old assumptions that instincts are dangerous, that reason must dominate the senses, that there is a truer world beyond this one, and that morality is grounded in facts, that free will makes us guilty, or that our body is something base and secondary. By re-evaluating, Nietzsche clears a space for a new affirmation of life. This, I believe, is the underlying unifying structure of the opening half of Twilight of the Idols. Why should you read this book? The first pages of Twilight of the Idols are absolutely marvelous. They give any newcomer a clear sense of what Nietzsche is trying to accomplish across many of his works. In fact, this is one of the few books in Nietzsche's oeuvre that I would confidently recommend as a true beginner's guide. Here we see his central themes laid out with clarity and force. Instincts, senses, the sensible world, passions and desires, and the human body. By contrast, the final 100 pages of the book are less systematic and far more technical. Nietzsche shifts from sweeping critiques of morality and philosophy to sharp fragmentary attacks on particular figures, cultures, and traditions. These later chapters demand more background knowledge of specific thinkers and poets, and they feel more like raids than sustained arguments. Still, they reveal the same Nietzschean hammer at work, testing, diagnosing, and dismantling idols wherever they appear. Let's end the video the same way Nietzsche ended this book. The hammer speaks. Why so hard? Spoke the kitchen coals once to the diamond, for are we not next of kin? Why so soft, O my brothers? I ask you thus, for are you not my brothers? Why so soft, so yielding and submissive? Why is there so much denial, self-denial in your hearts, so little destiny in your gazes? And if you will not be destinies and implacable, how else could you win with me someday? And if your hardness will not flash and cut to bits, how else could you create with me someday? For all the creators are hard, and it must seem blessed to you to impress your hand or millennia as on wax, blessed to write on the will of millennia as on bronze, harder than bronze, nobler than bronze. Only what is noblest is altogether hard. This new law table, O my brothers, I set over you, become hard. That concludes the book Twilight of the Idols, How to Philosophize with the Hammer. I invite you to leave any lingering questions or unclarities in the comment section, and I will make sure to answer. If you have any other comments or remarks, do let us know. If you want us to speak on a different book by Nietzsche, be sure to leave it in the comments. You want more Two Dudes Philosophy? Then subscribe and turn on the notification bell. For now, we are happy to serve you with philosophy. Bye!